do a little bit of that, and maybe we move that a little bit over that way, and okay. Perfect. You know, how bad could a sequel really be?
So, 1812. Tensions have been rising between the United States and Great Britain ever since the end of the American Revolution 29 years prior. This involved the British supplying Native Americans with weapons to fight the United States. This support would mainly go towards supplying Shawnee leader Tecumseh, who had been proving to be a real pain for the United States by uniting numerous tribes in order to resist American expansion into the interior of North America. This would lead to numerous conflicts between American troops and Tecumseh's alliance, such as the famous Battle of Tippecanoe. However, it wasn't only the support of the Native Americans which angered the United States. Britain had been violating American neutrality during the ongoing Napoleonic Wars in Europe by preventing trade with the French, as well as the impressment of American sailors, which, for those of you who don't know what that is, it's just fancy talk for kidnapping. These actions would greatly anger many within the American government, specifically the Democratic Republican Party led by President James Madison. They claimed that these actions taken by the British were an attempt to recolonize the United States, and the only way to prevent this was an invasion of the remaining British possessions within North America. This conclusion was not very popular with the other major political party at the time, the Federalists, objecting to the decision and claiming that the, quote, war hawks were just looking for a way to expand American territory, which wasn't too far off from the truth, but whatever. So with a narrow vote in Congress, the United States for the first time would officially declare war on June 18, 1812, beginning the War of 1812. Really?
Yep, you know it, pal.
Alright, let's get down to business now, shall we? Taking the initiative, the United States would send an invasion force led by General William Hull into Canada with the ultimate goal of freeing them from the tyranny of the British Crown. Although making rapid gains initially, the invasion would quickly slow as local Canadian forces would put up a fierce resistance to the invasion until British forces could arrive from Europe. The invasion would quickly go south both figuratively and literally for the United States as both Canadian and British forces pushed the American forces out of Canada and began an invasion of the Michigan Territory, where they would besiege the city of Detroit. Knowing American forces had been defeated alongside fearing for the safety of his family, who he had for some reason brought with him, General Hull would surrender Detroit to the British. Talk about bad timing for Bring Your Child to Work Day, am I right? Alright, fine, I'll move on. With this humiliating defeat, Hull would be court-martialed, convicted of cowardice, and sentenced to death before being pardoned. With Hull gone, American forces would focus all their efforts on stopping a British invasion both on land and by sea, which would culminate in the Battle of Lake Erie, with the US Navy pulling off a surprising victory over the much more powerful British Navy. This victory would allow Americans to retake Detroit and begin to shift their focus towards the Native Americans, specifically Tecumseh, who had continued to attack American troops, but now from within Canada. In response, the US would send out a detachment under the command of General William Henry Harrison in order to eliminate Tecumseh. Harrison would catch up to Tecumseh and his allies in modern-day Chatham, Canada, for the Battle of the Thames. The American troops would engage in fierce combat with the Native Americans and their British allies until an American cavalry charge broke the lines and killed Tecumseh. This would mark an end of widespread organized Native participation in the war as Tecumseh's alliance of tribes quickly disintegrated. However, this didn't mean that the Native attacks against the Americans ended, they just shifted from large battles in the Great Lakes region towards smaller raids in the upper Mississippi River area. Due to the United States only controlling the region for around a decade, paired with the lack of settlement, meant that the area was devoid of any major military presence. This vulnerability was taken advantage of by many chiefs. One of them happened to be Sauk War Chief Black Hawk, who would choose to attack the undermanned and undersupplied Fort Madison, which stood as the only American military fortification on the upper Mississippi as of 1813. The fort would quickly be abandoned and subsequently burned by the retreating American forces, allowing the tribes to operate uncontested in the area. Although actions like this would ultimately cripple American control over the upper Mississippi River for the remainder of the conflict, the United States couldn't really care about that at the moment because,
Wait a minute, how did that happen?
Well, little Jimmy, that happened because the British just wrapped up kicking down Napoleon's door and exiling him to a small island in the Mediterranean, so they had a whole lot more resources to spend on trying to defeat the United States.
How did you get in here?
In 1814, the British Navy would begin working their way up the Chesapeake Bay towards the nation's capital of Washington, D.C. The British would reach the city in August and begin to prepare for battle. Facing a much better supplied and trained army, President Madison determined that evacuating himself and the entire government would be more beneficial than an attempt at defending it with the few soldiers he had at his disposal. Side note, it was during this evacuation that First Lady Dolly Madison would gain fame for helping preserve numerous artifacts, such as the famous 1796 portrait of George Washington. Anyway, with the government leaving the city, the British moved on in and began burning it to the ground. Leaving the capital of the United States in ruins, the British would work their way up the Chesapeake Bay even more until reaching Baltimore, which in 1814 stood as the third largest city in the nation. A fierce defense of the city was organized by American militia troops stationed in the area, repulsing British advances. During the defense of the city, the British would bombard Fort McHenry, which was observed by a certain lawyer named Francis Scott Key, who was so moved by the stubborn defense put up by the fort's occupants that he wrote a poem about it, which would eventually evolve into a kind of popular song called the Star-Spangled Banner. Yeah, never heard of it either. Anyway, after around 4 days of fighting, the British officer in charge of the battle was killed by a sharpshooter, causing the British to retreat from Baltimore. Despite this major victory for the United States, the public just wanted the war to end. Similarly, in Britain, the public was getting really sick of wartime taxes, so in late 1814, both sides would meet in Belgium to begin peace negotiations. The ultimate result of these negotiations was the Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve of 1814. With both sides just kinda being done with the whole war thing, the treaty just stated that they would pretend the whole thing never really happened in the first place. No land was exchanged, all prisoners were returned. The only thing the treaty did, which wasn't part of the pre-war status quo, was that both sides said that they would eventually get around to solving some border disputes along the American-Canadian border, which, good job guys. Hope another petty dispute won't almost cause a third war. Anyway, the status quo was restored, the word inane got a new textbook example, and the war was over. Wait a minute, what is this? In 1814, we took a little trip, along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. We took a little bacon, and we took a little beans, and we caught the bloody British in the town of New Orleans. Oh god. So, since this is the 1800s, and even treaties take forever to arrive, both sides didn't officially know that the war was over until about a month after the treaty was signed. Due to this, British troops would attack the city of New Orleans in January of 1815. Meeting a well-dug-in American force led by General Andrew Jackson, the British landed, tried to take the city, and were defeated. Badly. Over 2,000 casualties compared to 70 in around half an hour type of badly. This final victory for the Americans allowed the United States to feel that they had decisively won the war, despite both sides more or less just giving up. Anyway, the Treaty of Ghent would be approved unanimously by both sides around a month after the battle, which officially brought an end to the War of 1812. And similar to the rather underwhelming effects of the Treaty of Ghent, the legacy of this conflict was very limited. In Britain, the war was a footnote even at the time, as right after the conclusion of the conflict in 1815, the Napoleonic Wars roared back to life. Similar to Britain, the war left Canada fairly unchanged despite a slight boost to a united Canadian pride, which eventually played a minor role in the unification of Canada in 1868. The two parties most affected by the conflict, though, happened to be the Native Americans and the United States itself. For the natives, the conflict would mark the last time that a major organized resistance against the expansion of the United States would prove to be both effective and possible. Some chiefs, such as Black Hawk, who participated in the war, would once again bear arms against the United States in the following decades. However, all attempts would fail to achieve the same success as Tecumseh had. For the United States, the conflict would produce numerous presidents, generals, and historical figures, marking the last time the U.S. mainland was invaded by a foreign military, alongside giving us a national anthem. However, the most important impact was felt politically. By the end of the conflict, the Federalist Party had all but collapsed. Their initial opposition to the war was viewed as unpatriotic by most after the stunning American victory in New Orleans. This collapse would allow American politics to be dominated solely by the Democratic-Republican Party. This domination would last throughout the remainder of the 1810s and until the end of the 1820s, when angry Andrew Jackson, who had ridden his fame from his victory in New Orleans and national stardom, created the Democratic Party. Jackson would be elected president in 1828, and alongside his more controversial actions, he would change politics from an institution controlled by the elite and begin transitioning it towards one controlled by the, quote, common man. And although these effects had a real impact on the nation, my favorite has to be the fact that a simple meat packer named Samuel Wilson in New York, who supplied troops rations during the conflict, would later evolve into the literal national personification of the United States. I don't know why I find that so incredibly entertaining, but imagine if that happened today. Gentlemen, step on up. Try some of this packaged meat I have conveniently sitting on this table for you. Don't be shy, fear adds personality after all. Step on up. Perfect. Now, tell me, son, would you like to have the honor of dying for your country?